Hey there. Tonight, we're setting sail into the heart of Greek myth, to a world of storms, gods, and endless seas, a place where cunning mattered as much as courage, and where the journey itself could last a lifetime. This is the story of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, master of wit, and hero of the long voyage home. Known for his clever mind as much as his bravery, his tale is one of trickery, loss, resilience, and the enduring hope of return. From the wooden horse at Troy to the trials of the open sea, his name became a symbol of survival against impossible odds. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who else is out there, drifting off to the same quiet story. So, dim the lights, let the waves quiet around you, close your eyes, and let's begin with the tale of Odysseus. Let us begin then with a man who was never entirely comfortable being ordinary. Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes and Anticlea, husband to Penelope, father to Telemachus, and a fellow whom even the gods could not quite agree upon. Some called him cunning, others crafty, and more than a few used less polite terms. But in Homer's Odyssey, he is introduced with the word polytropos, a wonderfully Greek term that can mean of many twists and turns. This is fitting, not only because he would later endure the longest, twistiest journey home imaginable, but because his personality itself bent in every direction. A man of strategies, improvisations, disguises, and, occasionally, downright fibs. If there was ever a fellow who could talk his way out of a sticky situation, or indeed talk himself into one, it was Odysseus. Now, Ithaca itself was not much to look at compared with the sprawling kingdoms of the mainland. It was a rugged island, rocky, windswept, perched in the Ionian Sea. Travellers from elsewhere might have sneered that it was hardly worth ruling at all. Yet for Odysseus, it was everything. His home, his inheritance, his kingdom. The Greeks, like many ancient peoples, didn't measure wealth merely in gold or luxuries, but in the land one ruled and the household one maintained. Ithaca's soil might have been stubborn, but it grew enough olives and grapes to keep its king fed, and its hills provided the goats and sheep that formed the backbone of Greek subsistence. What made Odysseus remarkable, though, was not Ithaca's landscape, but his mind. In the stories, he was not a hulking warrior like Ajax, nor a demigod like Heracles. Instead, he became legendary because he thought differently. Ancient Greeks valued this trait immensely, even as they mistrusted it. The word metis, cunning intelligence, was seen as both admirable and dangerous. A society built on honour and straightforward courage did not always know what to do with a man who preferred trickery to brute force. Yet time and again, Odysseus proved that sometimes a trick outlasts a spear. To understand him, it is useful to imagine the world in which he lived, the late Bronze Age Aegean, roughly the 12th century BCE, a time when powerful palatial centres dotted Greece, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, and traded with Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond. Ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean, carrying copper, tin, amber, and textiles. Warfare was brutal, often little more than raiding and burning. To survive, one needed not only strong arms, but also sharp wits. It is no surprise, then, that Odysseus came to embody the ideal of the clever survivor. There is a curious tale about his youth that already reveals his character. When he was still a young man, his grandfather Autolycus, notorious for being something of a con man himself, gave him the name Odysseus, which can mean the one who causes pain or the hated one. A charming family tradition, to be sure. The Greeks, you see, often believed names carried destiny, and in Odysseus's case, the meaning was prophetic. He caused pain to others, yes, but he also suffered it in abundance. One might say it was truth in advertising. Despite this ominous beginning, he built a life that appeared enviable. He married Penelope, a woman as clever as he, though considerably more patient. While Odysseus would spend decades wandering, Penelope's test of endurance was subtler, resisting 100 greedy suitors while keeping the household intact. Together, they had a son, Telemachus, who was still an infant when the drums of war began to beat. Ah, yes, the Trojan War. It is here that Odysseus's reputation truly took root. But before we rush off to Troy, let us linger on the fact that Odysseus never really wanted to go. Unlike Achilles, who sought glory, or Agamemnon, who sought power, Odysseus wanted to stay home. He enjoyed his hearth, his wife, and his quiet kingdom. When the Greek leaders gathered to march against Troy, Odysseus famously tried to avoid the summons. According to legend, he pretended to be mad, ploughing his field with an ox and a donkey yoked together, an absurd combination, and sowing salt instead of seed. A clever ruse, though perhaps not his finest. Unfortunately for him, Palamedes, another sharp-minded Greek, suspected the trick. To test Odysseus's sanity, Palamedes placed baby Telemachus in front of the plough. Odysseus, unwilling to kill his son, swerved aside, and his feigned madness was revealed. And so, reluctantly, he was bound for Troy. This episode tells us much about his character. Unlike many Greek heroes, Odysseus was not driven by blind passion or by the lure of Kleos, immortal fame, though he would later receive it. Instead, he was practical. He valued life at home over glory abroad, family over conquest. Yet he was also bound by the cultural web of obligation. The Greeks had sworn an oath years earlier to defend the marriage of Helen, the woman whose abduction by Paris sparked the war. Honour demanded that Odysseus join, no matter his personal preference. Now, as narrator, I must pause and note that much of this may be more myth than history. Scholars continue to debate whether the Trojan War was an actual conflict or a poetic exaggeration of smaller skirmishes. Excavations at Hisarlik, in modern-day Turkey, thought to be the site of ancient Troy, reveal evidence of destruction layers around 1200 BCE. There was indeed a city, and it likely did fall violently more than once. Whether it was destroyed because of a runaway queen with a fondness for handsome Trojans, however, is a separate matter. But the Greeks, ever fond of storytelling, elevated the event into a myth of destiny, and in those stories, Odysseus played a central role. His reputation grew throughout the war, not because he was strongest, but because he was indispensable. When Achilles sulked in his tent, Odysseus was the one who went to persuade him back to the battlefield. When the Greeks squabbled, Odysseus often acted as the diplomat. He was not above a bit of deception either, once sneaking into Troy disguised as a beggar to gather intelligence. One might call him the original spy, though perhaps without the tuxedo and martini. It is important to recognize how the ancient audience viewed such behavior. To the Greeks, heroes like Achilles embodied beer, force and sheer physical dominance. Odysseus, on the other hand, embodied Metis, cunning intelligence, resourcefulness, adaptability. These two qualities were often seen in tension, but also as complementary. In fact, the gods themselves reflected this dichotomy. Athena, who became Odysseus's patron, was the goddess of wisdom and strategy, while Ares represented raw, often reckless violence. That Odysseus found favour with Athena is no accident. They were kindred spirits, both preferring brains over brawn. In this way, Chapter 1 of our tale establishes the central theme. Odysseus as the man of many turns, the mortal who survives not by being invincible, but by being clever. He begins as a man reluctant to leave home, thrust into a world of war and obligation, and soon to become the most famous wanderer in myth. Already we see the seeds of his fate. The gods will both aid him and hinder him, mortals will both admire and mistrust him, and through it all he will rely on that peculiar blend of quick wit and stubborn endurance. If you close your eyes now, you might almost picture him, standing on the shores of Ithaca, gazing out over the grey, wine-dark sea, knowing that his life would never again be simple. His mind, forever calculating, was already churning with schemes and strategies. He was about to embark on a journey that would test not only his body, but his very identity. And so, the man of many turns takes his first step into legend. And with that, dear listener, let us end this first chapter. For if Odysseus is anything, he is patient. He waited 20 years to return home. Surely we can wait until the next chapter to see how he fares, once war and gods take hold of his fate. The Trojan War is one of those stories that has been told so often, so widely, and in so many variations, that it is sometimes difficult to know where myth ends and history begins. Was it a single war at all? Or was it a long memory of many raids condensed into one dazzling tale? Scholars still debate it. But for the Greeks of Homer's time, it was no mere squabble. It was the defining conflict of an age, the stage upon which gods and mortals mingled, and where Odysseus, much against his own will, would carve out his legend. The war, as you likely know, began with a beauty contest. Yes, it does sound faintly ridiculous, but the Greeks had a talent for turning seemingly trivial quarrels into cosmic upheaval. The story goes that Eris, goddess of strife, who incidentally was never invited to parties for very good reasons, tossed a golden apple among the guests at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. Upon the apple were the words to the fairest. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite immediately claimed it. To settle the dispute, they selected Paris, a Trojan prince of dubious judgment, as judge. Each goddess attempted to bribe him. Hera promised political power. Athena promised wisdom and victory in battle. And Aphrodite promised the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Paris, with the impeccable foresight of a young man led by his hormones, chose Aphrodite. The trouble, of course, was that the most beautiful woman alive, Helen of Sparta, was already married to Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon. Paris carried her off, willingly or otherwise depending on which poet you prefer, and suddenly 1,000 ships were being launched across the Aegean. The Greeks rallied under Agamemnon's command, bound by the famous oath sworn years earlier when Helen first married. Every suitor of Helen had agreed that if ever she were taken, they would all come to her husband's aid. Honour, you see, is a dangerous glue. Once it sticks, it can drag everyone into catastrophe. Now, Where does Odysseus enter this grand pageant of egos, gods, and questionable decisions? As I mentioned before, he wanted no part of it. He valued Penelope and his infant son above the quarrels of kings. But the oath bound him as well, and once Palamedes exposed his feigned madness, there was no escape. And so, Odysseus prepared to leave his rocky Ithaca for the long, uncertain war at Troy. When the Greek armies gathered at Aulis, Odysseus quickly proved himself indispensable. He was not, by all accounts, the most charismatic commander. Agamemnon wore that dubious crown, but he had a gift for strategy and diplomacy. The Greeks were a fractious lot, each leader stubborn, proud, and not terribly inclined to follow another's orders. Odysseus often served as the voice of reason, persuading quarrelsome kings to work together. One can almost imagine him sighing, perhaps rubbing his temples, as yet another heroic hothead demanded his way. But the gods were watching. They always were in these stories, and they had their favourites. Athena, as mentioned, looked kindly on Odysseus, admiring his cleverness. Poseidon, however, would later take a rather dim view of him. Hera and Aphrodite had their own concerns, bickering endlessly, while Zeus occasionally stirred the pot for his own amusement. One might be forgiven for thinking that the Trojan War was less about mortals fighting, and more about divine politics spilling over onto Earth. Before battle was joined, there was a curious incident that highlights Odysseus's role. The Greeks learned from a prophecy that the war could not be won without the participation of Achilles. The young warrior, whose mother Thetis had dipped him in the river Styx, making him nearly invulnerable. Achilles, however, was hidden away by his mother, disguised as a girl among the daughters of a king. She hoped to keep him far from the dangers of war. Who then was sent to uncover him? Odysseus, of course. He arrived at the court, laid out gifts before the maidens, fine clothing, jewellery, and one curious addition: weapons. As the young women admired the fabrics, one figure could not resist seizing a sword and shield. That naturally was Achilles. Odysseus's trick worked, and thus the greatest warrior of the Greeks was recruited. Already we see a pattern. Again and again during the war, Odysseus played the role of the clever catalyst, the one who devised the schemes that enabled the Greeks to move forward. Without him, many of the pivotal events of the Trojan War might never have happened. He was less the boulder charging down the hill, more the lever shifting the mountain. The war itself, according to Homer and others, lasted 10 years. The poets tended to skip over much of the dreary fighting, preferring instead to focus on the grand personalities and the divine interventions. Odysseus featured prominently in several episodes. In the Iliad, we see him act as diplomat when Agamemnon and Achilles quarrel. When Achilles withdraws from battle, sulking in his tent, Odysseus is among those sent to persuade him back. The attempt fails, but the role is telling. He was the negotiator, the man trusted to reason with the unreasonable. There is also the story of the bow. Philoctetes, a Greek hero, possessed the bow of Heracles, an essential weapon according to prophecy. Yet Philoctetes had been abandoned on an island early in the war, stricken by a foul wound and unbearable stench. Years later, the Greeks realized they needed him. Who could persuade him to return after such betrayal? Odysseus again. His mission was not without controversy. Some versions say he deceived Philoctetes, others that he persuaded him honestly. Either way, he secured the bow, fulfilling another thread of destiny. This combination of trickery and diplomacy reveals why Odysseus fascinated the Greeks. He was not straightforward. He could be manipulative, even ruthless. Yet he was also necessary. In an age when warlords prized brute force, he represented the power of intellect, for better or worse. And though the Greeks admired him, they also feared him. Clever men, after all, are unpredictable. As the war dragged on, Odysseus fought bravely when needed. Homer does not deny him courage, but his true fame lay in his mind. The culmination of this came, of course, with the Trojan horse. By the 10th year, the Greeks were weary. Troy's walls seemed unassailable. Direct assault had failed countless times. And so Odysseus proposed something radical: build a giant wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to conceal soldiers. Leave it at Troy's gates and pretend to sail away. The Trojans, he reasoned, would drag it inside as a trophy. Now, one must admire the audacity. Ancient audiences certainly did. The trick worked too well. The Trojans celebrated, feasted, and dragged the horse into the city. By night, Odysseus and his hidden companions emerged, opened the gates, and Troy was doomed. The city burned, its people slaughtered or enslaved. The Greeks had won, and Odysseus had ensured his name would never be forgotten. Yet, and here is the twist, such cunning came at a price. The gods, you see, are not fond of mortals who appear too clever for their own good. The Greeks had already angered Athena by desecrating her temples. And Odysseus, in particular, drew the ire of Poseidon, whose son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, he would later blind. But even before that fateful encounter, his trick with the horse left a mark. He had defeated Troy not with heroism, but with deception. Some admired it. Others whispered that it was dishonourable. And so, as the Greeks sailed away from the smouldering ruins of Troy, they carried both victory and doom. For while Achilles had died in glory, and Agamemnon would return to meet his tragic end, Odysseus's fate was stranger still. His war was over, but his true story had barely begun. The gods were watching, the sea awaited, and the man of many turns would soon find that returning home could be more difficult than taking an enemy city. Pause a moment and imagine him then, standing on the deck of a ship, the smoke of Troy fading behind him. Ithaca somewhere far across the horizon. He must have thought, as any weary soldier would, that his troubles were nearly done. Little did he know the real adventure had just begun. When we think of Odysseus, one image tends to rise above all others: the great wooden horse standing before the gates of Troy. It has become almost synonymous with cleverness itself. Even today, we use the term Trojan horse to describe a cunning ruse that sneaks danger inside under the guise of a gift. Though these days it tends to involve computer viruses rather than Greek soldiers. But in the original story, this was Odysseus's crowning invention, the stratagem that ended a decade-long war. By the 10th year of the Trojan War, both sides were exhausted. The Greeks had burned the surrounding countryside, raided villages, and fought countless duels, but Troy's walls remained unbroken. Those walls, incidentally, were said to have been built by the gods themselves, Poseidon and Apollo, when they were briefly punished to serve King Laomedon of Troy. Whether that's true or just a piece of mythological marketing, it gave the impression that the city was impregnable. And indeed, despite all the might of Mycenaean warriors, the city stood firm. The Greeks were growing restless. Their ships had been away from home for years. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared, and morale sagged. Some heroes had already met their fates. Achilles struck down by Paris, Ajax the Greater dead, and countless others gone. To besiege a city for 10 years in the Bronze Age was no small feat. One imagines lice, bad food, and an awful lot of shouting matches. Odysseus, practical as ever, realised that brute force would no longer suffice. If Troy could not be taken from without, it must be taken from within. Here enters the idea of the horse. Now the Greeks loved their horses. Chariots were symbols of prestige, and cavalry, while not decisive in Greek warfare, was associated with nobility. To present a great wooden horse as an offering would appeal to Trojan pride. Some ancient sources even suggest that horses were sacred to Poseidon, making the gift appear doubly significant. The plan, then, was simple in conception but audacious in execution. Build a colossal horse, hollow it out, hide soldiers inside, and leave it as if it were a dedication to the gods. The Greeks would pretend to abandon the siege, sailing out of sight, while the Trojans, in their relief, would drag the trophy into their city. Of course, a plan like this raises practical questions. How large was this horse? How many men could it conceal? Ancient poets are delightfully inconsistent on this matter. Virgil, writing centuries later in the Aeneid, has the horse bristling with armed warriors, practically an entire battalion. Homer, in the Odyssey, is vaguer. Archaeologists, ever practical, point out that constructing such a structure out of Bronze Age timber would have been a formidable engineering task. Yet, as with all myths, the point is not logistics but symbolism. The horse was a deception embodied, a gift hiding destruction, a reversal of expectations. There is even a theory among historians that the horse may not have been literal at all. Some suggest it could have been a poetic metaphor for a siege engine, perhaps a battering ram or a mobile tower, that allowed the Greeks to breach the walls. Others argue it might recall an earthquake, since Poseidon was both god of horses and of tremors, and the city's fall could have been poetically attributed to his horse. But the Greeks themselves, when they told the story, delighted in the sheer theatricality of the ruse. It was not enough for Troy to fall. It had to fall with a twist worthy of Odysseus. And so the horse was built. The craftsman, led by Epeius, shaped its massive frame. Into its belly climbed Odysseus and his chosen companions, heroes like Menelaus, Diomedes, and perhaps even Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. They armed themselves and waited in darkness, surrounded by the creak of wood and the smell of pitch. Outside, the Greek army pretended to sail away, though in truth they lurked just beyond sight, ready to return at a signal. The Trojans, upon discovering the deserted camp and the horse, reacted in predictable confusion. What was this enormous thing? A gift? A trap? A monument to Greek desperation? Opinions varied. Laocoon, a Trojan priest, famously warned, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." He urged the Trojans to burn the horse, to smash it to pieces, to distrust anything left by the enemy. It was excellent advice, and had they listened, this story would be considerably shorter. Unfortunately for Laocoon, the gods had other plans. According to the tale, 2 serpents emerged from the sea and strangled Laocoon and his sons. The Trojans, horrified, interpreted this as a divine sign. Clearly the horse was sacred, and Laocoon had offended the gods by urging its destruction. Such is the dangerous logic of myth. Ignore the practical warning, heed the ominous spectacle. Thus convinced, the Trojans dragged the horse into the city with ropes, rejoicing that the long war was finally over. That night, Troy celebrated. Fires blazed, wine flowed, and laughter echoed through streets that had known only fear and siege for a decade. While the Trojans slept, oblivious in their triumph, the hollow belly of the horse stirred. Odysseus and his companions emerged silently, their armour glinting in the torchlight. They opened the gates, and the Greek army, who had returned under cover of darkness, poured in. Troy was undone, the city burned. Priam, the aged king, was slaughtered at his altar. Women and children were taken captive. Cassandra, the prophetess cursed never to be believed, was dragged from the temple of Athena. Aeneas, in later Roman tradition, fled with his household to found a new destiny in Italy. But for the Greeks, the victory was total. The war was won. And Odysseus, though not the only architect of destruction, was forever linked with the cunning horse that brought the mighty city down. Now, let us step back and consider the symbolism. To the Greeks, Odysseus' trick represented the triumph of intelligence over brute strength. For 10 years, armies had battered against Troy to no avail. Yet in a single night of guile, the walls fell. It was a lesson, both inspiring and unsettling. Admire cleverness, yes, but beware it too. After all, the Trojans had welcomed what seemed a gift, and it destroyed them. The story became a cultural warning. Appearances deceive, and sometimes the most beautiful offering hides ruin inside. For Odysseus himself, the horse marked both his greatest success and the beginning of his greatest troubles. The gods, as always, were watching. Poseidon, whose association with horses made the ruse particularly audacious, did not take kindly to mortals using such symbols to deceive. And Athena, though she admired Odysseus, was angered by the desecrations that followed Troy's fall. The Greeks had not shown proper reverence, and divine retribution was brewing. One might say that while the horse ended one journey, it launched another. Odysseus's long, harrowing voyage home. It is also worth remembering that not all Greeks approved of Odysseus's methods. In some versions, Ajax the Lesser sneered at the trick, considering it unworthy of true warriors. The tension between straightforward heroism and cunning strategy runs throughout Greek literature. Yet time and again, Odysseus proves that in a world governed by both men and gods, a sharp mind is often the most dangerous weapon. Picture him then, as dawn broke over the smoking ruins of Troy. Amidst the cries of the vanquished and the triumph of the victors, Odysseus must have felt a swell of satisfaction. His idea had worked. The war was finished. Soon, surely, he would return to Penelope and Ithaca, to the quiet life he had always preferred. But if he allowed himself that comforting thought, it was premature. For even as the ashes cooled, the gods were plotting, the sea was stirring, and Odysseus's true Odyssey was only beginning. It is one of life's small ironies that Odysseus, who had survived 10 years of war at Troy, was undone not by swords or spears, but by his own tongue. It wasn't an arrow that delayed him, nor the cunning of enemies, but rather the impulse to shout his name into the wind, like a man posting on social media after winning a minor argument. Pride, in the world of Greek myth, is a dangerous business. And when one's pride collides with the dignity of the gods, the results are rarely pleasant. Let us begin by remembering who Poseidon was. To the ancient Greeks, Poseidon was not a gentle seaside deity presiding over holiday paddles and seashell collections. He was the shaker of the earth, the god whose temper sent walls tumbling, whose trident could raise islands from the sea or swallow them whole. Fishermen, traders, and soldiers depended on the sea for survival, yet they feared it too. The sea was life and death in equal measure. In Poseidon, that duality was personified. To fall foul of him was no small misstep. It was rather like irritating the weather itself. Now, Odysseus had already participated in a number of small impieties during the sack of Troy, as had many Greeks. The looting of temples, the dragging of statues into the dirt, the violation of sacred spaces. These were things the gods never forgot. Athena herself, once a loyal patron of the Greeks, grew cold with disapproval. But none of that compared to what was about to unfold with Polyphemus, Poseidon's own son. The tale of the Cyclops begins with landfall on a curious island. Imagine Odysseus and his weary sailors, battered by storms, gazing at a shoreline of rolling hills and caves cut deep into rock. These caves, as it happened, were not carved by human hands, but claimed by the Cyclopes, a race of giant shepherds. They had no ships, no agriculture, and no councils. Homer describes them as lawless, not in the sense of wickedness, but in the sense of isolation. Each man ruled his own household, and no one gave heed to neighbours. Civilization, in the Greek sense, did not touch them. For the Greeks, hospitality, or xenia, was sacred. A host was expected to welcome strangers, provide food and drink, and send them on their way with gifts. The guest, in turn, was expected to be respectful. This system was more than courtesy. It was bound up with religion. For Zeus himself was patron of strangers and travellers. To violate hospitality was to offend Olympus. Thus, when Odysseus and his men wandered into Polyphemus's cave and helped themselves to cheese and milk, they were testing the very boundaries of what was acceptable. Polyphemus, returning home, was not impressed. A giant of a man, or rather, a man in shape, but not in civility, he rolled a stone across the entrance that only he could move. Then, with no hesitation, he snatched up two of Odysseus's companions and devoured them raw. Homer is graphic here, as though to emphasize the sheer horror of lawlessness. To the Greek ear, Polyphemus was not just a monster, but an anti-citizen, one who knew nothing of laws, councils, or proper respect. Trapped in the cave, Odysseus faced a dilemma. Violence was useless, for the stone at the entrance required strength beyond mortal measure. Escape seemed impossible, and so he turned, as always, to cunning. Producing a skin of strong wine, a gift from earlier travels, he offered it to Polyphemus. The Cyclops, unused to such potent drink, consumed it greedily. His single eye drooped, his head swayed. When asked his name, Odysseus replied with calculated mischief, "Nobody." And so, when the sharpened stake was driven into Polyphemus's eye, and the giant roared in agony, calling his neighbours for aid, they asked who was harming him. "Nobody!" he screamed. And satisfied that he was suffering from some divine illness rather than mortal attack, they left him to his misery. The escape was another masterpiece of cunning. Odysseus tied his men beneath the bellies of sheep, so that when Polyphemus, blind, felt along their woolly backs as they left the cave, he never noticed the men clinging underneath. It was, one must admit, both ingenious and slightly undignified. Heroes in Greek myth are not always graceful in their triumphs. At this point, the story might have ended well. They had escaped a grisly death, fooled a giant, and reached the safety of their ships. But Odysseus, unable to resist the temptation, shouted back across the water. He mocked Polyphemus, taunted him, and most fatally revealed his name and lineage. "Tell them it was Odysseus of Ithaca who blinded you," he boasted. Polyphemus then lifted his arms to the sky and prayed to his father Poseidon. It was a simple prayer, but devastating, that Odysseus might never reach home, or if fated to do so, that he should come late, alone in misery, to find sorrow waiting. Poseidon heard, and thus the die was cast. From this point forward, every storm, every detour, every misfortune at sea was tinged with Poseidon's anger. One might view the Odyssey as a series of unfortunate accidents, but Homer makes it clear these were not accidents. They were the steady hand of a god offended, guiding the winds and waves to thwart a mortal. Historically, this story reflects something deeper about Greek life. To the Greeks, the sea was at once highway and hazard. Traders depended upon it, colonists spread across it, and soldiers sailed upon it to wage wars. Yet the sea was fickle. A journey meant for a week might take months. Pirates lurked in hidden coves. Sudden storms could smash a fleet. Poseidon embodied this unpredictability, and the story of Odysseus gave mythological form to the daily anxiety of sailors. There is also the matter of hubris. The Greeks told such tales not only for entertainment, but as cautionary parables. Odysseus's mistake was not the blinding of Polyphemus. After all, survival justified cunning. His mistake was in boasting afterwards, in placing his pride above his safety. To insult a mortal enemy is foolish enough. To insult a god's child is reckless beyond measure. As Odysseus's ships sailed away, the waves grew restless. One can almost imagine the scene, the men rowing hard, glancing nervously at the horizon, while Odysseus stands tall, defiant, still calling taunts into the wind. And somewhere beneath the waves, Poseidon stirs, hearing his son's prayer. The god does not appear in dramatic lightning or thunder, as Zeus might. Instead, his vengeance is quieter, drawn out, not the blow of a sword, but the endless wearing down of patience, hope, and strength. In this way, Poseidon is unlike other gods. Ares brings sudden violence. Apollo sends plague. Hera unleashes storms of jealousy. But Poseidon prefers the slow grind, the long attrition. His revenge was not to strike Odysseus dead on the spot, but to ensure that every step of his journey would be delayed, twisted, and poisoned with sorrow. The Greeks, listening to this tale around the hearth, would have nodded knowingly. They too had been delayed by sudden winds. They too had cursed the sea as their little ships were tossed about like leaves. The myth of Odysseus was not just about one man's misfortune. It was a mirror of every sailor's dread. And so, Odysseus became not only a warrior, but the archetypal wanderer, the man who struggles against the currents of fate and the hostility of the divine. Without Poseidon's wrath, he might have been a clever king with a modest legend. With it, he became a figure of enduring fascination, a symbol of resilience against forces greater than oneself. Picture him now, at the prow of his ship, gazing into the distance. Behind him men whisper nervously. Ahead, the horizon is blank. The sea heaves beneath them, restless, alive. Every wave might conceal a blessing or a curse. Every gust of wind might bring them closer to Ithaca, or hurl them leagues away. Such was the gift Poseidon gave his son Polyphemus. Not immediate vengeance, but the long torment of endless wandering. And so, the story of Odysseus, from this moment on, is shadowed by the sea god's anger. Each new landfall, each new trial, can be traced back to that moment of pride outside the Cyclops' cave. For once, a god has fixed his gaze upon a mortal. There is no easy escape, only endurance. It is said that temptation is the true test of a man, and Odysseus, poor fellow, never lacked for it. If the Trojan War proved his courage, and the Cyclops proved his cunning, then the long years that followed would test his endurance against softer, subtler forces, those that came not with spears and roars, but with gentle hands, sweet fruit, and whispers of forgetfulness. The first such trial came with the Lotus Eaters. Now, on the surface, the story seems almost laughably simple. Odysseus and his men land on a strange shore, encounter friendly locals who offer them fruit, and those who eat it promptly forget everything else. It sounds like a cautionary tale about sampling unfamiliar cuisine while abroad, but beneath the surface lies something much deeper, a meditation on memory, identity, and the human need for purpose. Let us set the scene. Imagine the weary ships of Odysseus gliding into a tranquil bay. The sun is warm, the air fragrant, the waves gentle. After storms and terrors, after the howling of Cyclopes, this place seems paradise. The inhabitants, described vaguely by Homer, are not hostile warriors but peaceful folk, living on the fruit of the lotus plant. They do not threaten the Greeks with swords. Rather, they welcome them with food. It is the softest kind of danger, the sort that seduces rather than strikes. The lotus fruit, according to Homer, had the peculiar property of making one forget home. To eat it was to lose all desire to return, to drift into contented apathy. No hunger, no ambition, no longing, just a pleasant stupor. To a Greek audience, this was terrifying. For the essence of Greek identity lay in one's obligations, to family, to household, to city, to gods. To abandon those was to cease being truly human. Here, Odysseus' role as leader is revealed in a new light. When his men tasted the fruit and begged to remain, he did not join them. He did not scold them either. Instead, with a mixture of firmness and compassion, he dragged them bodily back to the ships and bound them to the benches until the intoxicating spell wore off. It was not cruelty, it was protection. He knew that to surrender to forgetfulness was to lose themselves entirely. Historically, scholars have puzzled over the lotus plant. Some suggest it may have been a reference to the date palm, others to a type of jujube fruit, or even a kind of narcotic herb. Whatever the real inspiration, the meaning is clear. It symbolized escape through forgetfulness, a temptation as dangerous as any spear. In the wider cultural sense, this episode speaks volumes. The Greeks valued memory. Their epics were sung, their histories recited, their genealogies traced carefully. To forget one's past, to abandon the struggle for glory or return, was unthinkable. Even in death, heroes sought remembrance, for to be forgotten was a second death. Thus, the Lotus Eaters represented not merely laziness, but the erasure of self. One can almost hear the drowsy voices of the sailors. Why return to Ithaca? Why endure storms, monsters, and the anger of Poseidon? Here, the sun is warm, the fruit sweet, the days easy. Why suffer when one can drift? And Odysseus, shaking his head, must have thought of Penelope weaving by her loom, of Telemachus growing into manhood, of Ithaca's rocky hills waiting for his tread. He could not yield, not even to this soft oblivion. It is striking, too, that Homer placed this story early in the wanderings. Perhaps he wished to remind his listeners that the real challenge of life is not always in battle, but in resisting the gentle slide into forgetfulness. Most of us will not fight cyclopes or outwit sorceresses, but many of us know the pull of distractions that tempt us to forget our duties. The lotus is, in its way, timeless. But Odysseus's voyage was not a straight path, and the lotus was only one of many snares. After leaving that land, his men still shaken, he would face temptations of other kinds, not the fruit of a plant, but the enchantments of goddesses. Take, for instance, the island of Circe, which he would reach a little later. Circe was no mere hostess with odd fruit. She was a sorceress, a daughter of Helios, skilled in herbs and charms. When Odysseus's men wandered into her halls, she welcomed them with food and wine, only to transform them into swine with a wave of her wand. One might say it was the very opposite of the lotus, not forgetfulness, but bestiality, stripping men not of memory but of their humanity itself. And yet, even here, Odysseus prevailed, aided by Hermes, who gave him the herb moly to resist her magic. With his sword drawn, he compelled Circe to restore his men and swear no further harm. But what followed is curious. He did not leave at once. Instead, he and his men remained for a full year, feasting, resting, and, dare one say, enjoying themselves rather more than was strictly necessary. Here lies another layer of temptation: comfort. After years of hardship, who would not wish to pause, to linger in warmth and pleasure? But once again, it was Odysseus who reminded his men, and perhaps himself, that their true goal was not endless banquets, but home. He urged them on, though Circe herself tried to delay them. If the lotus represented forgetfulness, and Circe's island represented indulgence, then Calypso's cave, encountered later, was the ultimate test. For Calypso, a nymph of the sea, fell in love with Odysseus, and offered him immortality if he would remain with her. Imagine that. No more storms, no more dangers, no more decay. To live forever, beloved of a goddess, free from suffering. Many mortals would have seized it gladly. And yet Odysseus longed for home. He longed not for eternal bliss, but for Ithaca, for Penelope's quiet strength, for the familiar stones of his hearth, for the mortality that was his. For in Greek thought, immortality was not always a blessing. To live forever without one's true place, one's true identity, was no life at all. Thus, across these episodes, we see a pattern. Odysseus is tempted again and again, not only by monsters and storms, but by the desire to forget, to yield, to settle for ease. And each time he resists, sometimes with cunning, sometimes with sheer will. It is this that makes him heroic in the Greek sense. Not perfect, not without fault, but steadfast in clinging to his identity, his duty, his longing for home. And what of his men? They were less steadfast. Again and again they faltered, eating the lotus, succumbing to Circe, slaughtering the cattle of Helios. In them we see the frailty of mortals, in Odysseus the determination of one man. It is little wonder that, in the end, he alone returned. One can almost imagine Homer's audience nodding knowingly as they heard these tales. For life itself was full of lotus fruits, chances to drift, to abandon toil, to forget obligations. The farmer might grow weary of ploughing, the soldier of marching, the mother of weaving. But to yield was to abandon one's name, one's place, one's very humanity. Better to endure, to remember, to strive. So, as Odysseus's ships pulled away from the land of the Lotus Eaters, with groaning men bound to benches to keep them from leaping overboard, one senses the quiet lesson. Memory is survival, and home is worth the struggle. Even in the face of sweetness, one must not forget. And from that tranquil but dangerous shore, they sailed once more into Poseidon's seas, carrying with them not only the memory of temptation resisted, but the heavy knowledge that far greater tests still lay ahead. If Odysseus's wanderings had already felt like a nightmare, storms, cyclopes, and soporific fruit, then his next trial was the stuff of true terror, a journey into the land of the dead. For most men, death marked the end of travel. For Odysseus, it was just another destination on the itinerary. The descent into the underworld is one of the most haunting episodes in the Odyssey, not merely because of the shades he encounters, but because it reveals the Greek imagination of death itself. This was no Christian heaven with harps, nor fiery inferno with pitchforks. The Homeric underworld was a shadowy place, a realm of murmuring spirits, where even the greatest heroes wandered without joy. For a warrior like Achilles to declare he would rather be a servant among the living than a king among the dead spoke volumes. Death was bleak, memory faint, and glory a thin consolation. But before Odysseus could enter this dim land, he had to prepare. It was Circe, that knowledgeable sorceress, who instructed him. After his men had feasted for a year under her roof, as one does when one accidentally overstays a holiday, she told him bluntly that his path home required counsel from the dead. Specifically, he must seek Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, who retained wisdom even beyond the grave. The journey began with sacrifices. Odysseus and his men sailed to the edge of Oceanus, to that misty boundary where the living world gives way to the shadowy realm. There he dug a trench, poured libations of honey, milk, wine, and water, and sprinkled barley. Then came the darkest part, the sacrifice of black rams, their blood flowing into the trench to summon the shades. In Homer's telling, it is the blood that grants the dead the ability to speak, as if memory itself were restored by the vitality of life. And so they came. First, the spirits of ordinary men and women, a silent crowd pressing forward, eager for a sip of blood to recover speech. Then figures of renown, mothers, warriors, kings. Odysseus, sword in hand, kept them at bay until Tiresias arrived. It is a chilling picture. A living man standing among the dead, surrounded by murmuring shades, his blade flashing in the dim light, the air heavy with the scent of blood and ash. When Tiresias spoke, it was not with comfort but with warning. Odysseus, he said, would indeed reach home, but not easily. Poseidon's wrath still lay heavy upon him. Worse still, if his men harmed the cattle of Helios, the sun god, doom would follow. And when at last he did return, he would find trouble in his own halls. Arrogant suitors feasting at Penelope's table, draining his stores, plotting to claim his throne. The prophet even foretold a strange journey after his return, to wander once more until he carried an oar inland so far that men mistook it for a winnowing fan, a sign that he had appeased Poseidon at last. Only then might he enjoy a peaceful death, old and full of years. This prophecy, solemn and heavy, gave Odysseus not comfort but a sense of inevitability. His path would be long, his trials bitter, but his homecoming certain. provided he resisted temptation and endured. Yet Tiresias was not the only figure to speak. His own mother, Anticlea, came forward, and here the Odyssey strikes deeply human chords. Odysseus had left her alive, but now she was among the dead. When he asked how she died, she replied simply, "Of longing for him." It is a moment of piercing sorrow. Not battlefield wounds, not disease, but grief and waiting that stole her life. For all his cunning and strength, Odysseus could not protect her from that. One almost hears the sigh in the poet's voice. Then came Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek host at Troy, whose fate had been grim indeed. Returning home, he was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. His words to Odysseus were bitter. "Never trust women," he said, "not even your wife." One imagines Odysseus listening uneasily, thinking of Penelope weaving back in Ithaca. Yet Agamemnon's caution was not entirely misplaced, for in Greek myth, betrayal within the household was a recurring theme, a warning that war's end did not always bring peace. And then came Achilles, the great hero, peerless in battle, who had chosen a short life with glory over a long, obscure one. Now, in the gloom of Hades, he admitted that glory was cold comfort. He would rather serve a poor man alive than rule among the dead. To Homer's audience, this was a striking reversal. The greatest of warriors confessed that death stripped all prizes of meaning. Yet when Odysseus reminded him that his son Neoptolemus fought bravely at Troy, Achilles brightened, proud even in death of his lineage. Memory again provided some balm. One by one, other shades appeared. Ajax, still bitter over the quarrel with Odysseus about Achilles' armour. Heracles, whose labours were legendary. Minos, the judge of souls. Each encounter layered new reflections on mortality, glory, and loss. It is a catalogue not of monsters, but of memory, a roll call of those who fought, who ruled, who loved, and who died. Historically, this episode offers us glimpses into Greek beliefs about death. Unlike later traditions of reward and punishment, Homer's underworld was a place of shadows, where all, noble or base, shared a common fate. There were exceptions: Elysium for a chosen few, eternal torment for figures like Tantalus and Sisyphus. But for the majority, death was simply dimness. The emphasis was not on heaven or hell, but on being remembered among the living. To be sung of by bards, to have one's deeds told at feasts, was to defy the oblivion of Hades. For the storyteller by the hearth, this passage also served another purpose. It linked Odysseus' tale with the larger cycle of Greek myth. By encountering Agamemnon, Achilles, Ajax, and others, Odysseus' story bound itself to the saga of Troy, reminding listeners that all these threads were woven together in one great tapestry of myth. As Odysseus stood among the dead, holding his sword to control the clamouring shades, one cannot help but sense his isolation. He was a living man in a land of the dead, a figure of warmth surrounded by cold. He must have longed for sunlight, for the crash of waves, even for the wearying trials of the sea. And yet he stayed until he heard all he must, until Tiresias' prophecy was secured, until he had spoken to his mother, until he had glimpsed the cost of glory in Achilles' words. Only then did he retreat, fleeing back to the ship, heart heavy, soul thoughtful. When his oarsmen rowed away from that dark shore, I imagined there was silence among them. Men who had fought wars and seen bloodshed now carried memories of the dead pressing close, of voices whispering in the gloom. Perhaps they rowed faster than usual, eager to feel the spray of seawater, eager to smell salt air instead of the stench of blood sacrifices. To have walked briefly in Hades is enough to make even storm-tossed seas feel like a blessing. And so, Odysseus left the underworld behind, but its lessons clung to him. Memory, duty, endurance. These were the themes reinforced in the Land of Shades. For the living, the task was clear: to act so that one's name would be remembered, so that even in Hades, one might find comfort in knowing the bard still sang. As his black ship slipped once more into Poseidon's domain, Odysseus carried not only the weariness of travel, but the weight of prophecy. Ahead lay Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of the sun, the song of the sirens. Yet behind him, in memory, drifted the pale faces of the dead, a reminder of what awaited all men in the end. If Odysseus's visit to the underworld had shown him the bleak certainty of death, his next leg upon the open sea brought him face to face with something altogether different. The living hazards of temptation and terror, the sort that no funeral dirge could soothe. The Aegean and wider Mediterranean were full of reefs, shifting currents and storms, but the Greek imagination clothed these natural dangers in flesh, feather and fang. And so the myths gave us sirens to embody the lure of knowledge, and monsters like Scylla and Charybdis to dramatise the no-win situation sailors knew all too well. Circe, that dependable font of inconvenient truths, was the one who briefed him on what lay ahead. Having just helped him speak with the dead, she did not sugarcoat matters. In fact, her tone, at least as Homer presents it, is rather matter-of-fact, as though one always prepares houseguests by listing off monsters, whirlpools, and murderous cliffs. She warned Odysseus of three things: the sirens, whose songs no man could resist; Scylla, a six-headed horror that would devour men whole; and Charybdis, the great maw of the sea, a whirlpool capable of swallowing an entire vessel. For a modern listener, one might think, surely this is an exaggeration, the stuff of poetic fancy. But for ancient Greek sailors, these tales reflected lived anxiety. The Mediterranean, though beautiful, was also treacherous. Narrow straits, sudden storms, and strong currents made the sea as much an adversary as a pathway. Myth and reality wove together, and so the voyage of Odysseus became not only entertainment, but instruction, a reminder that the ocean's beauty is matched by its peril. The sirens, those infamous singers, were not fish-tailed mermaids as later art would suggest, but part woman, part bird creatures, perched upon rocky crags. Their hybrid form echoed Near Eastern motifs of bird women linked with death and enchantment, and their irresistible power lay in their voices. They promised knowledge, not just beauty or love, but total knowledge of the world. For a seafaring people who lived by rumour, memory, and uncertain navigation, such an offer was intoxicating. To know all fates, all events, all histories, who could resist? Odysseus, ever the curious man, certainly could not. But he was also cautious, and Circe's warning still rang in his ears. He ordered his men to plug their ears with beeswax, softening it with their hands and pressing it into place, a sight that must have looked comical if not for the deadly seriousness of the task. Then, with the solemnity of a man preparing for temptation, he instructed them to lash him tightly to the mast, and no matter what he shouted, they were not to untie him. His men obeyed, no doubt with the faint amusement of soldiers who rarely get to tie up their own commander. As the ship approached, the sirens began their song. Homer wisely does not attempt to give us the tune, for how can mortal poetry capture a sound that enslaves the will? Instead, he records the words. They hailed Odysseus by name, calling him glorious, promising him knowledge of all things under the sun. And Odysseus, true to form, struggled furiously against his bonds, straining to leap overboard, screaming at his crew to release him. They, deaf to his pleas, rowed on with grim determination, eyes fixed ahead. The ropes cut into his flesh as he twisted, but they held, and the ship glided safely past. Only once the music faded into silence did his body slump, spent and trembling against the mast. He had heard the sirens, but survived. The episode became a parable in Greek thought. The sirens embodied not just lust or danger, but the peril of unrestrained curiosity, the hunger for knowledge without discipline. Later philosophers would reinterpret them as symbols of cosmic harmony or deceptive pleasure, while medieval writers turned them into temptresses of the flesh. Yet in Homer's world, their menace was simpler and deeper. They offered wisdom that was not meant for mortals, a vision too powerful to bear. Odysseus alone among men heard their song and lived, but only because he bound himself first. No sooner had his ship escaped this melodious doom than the greater hazard appeared, the dreaded passage between Scylla and Charybdis. Mariners believed this strait, with its violent currents and rocky cliffs, corresponded to the Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily, a channel notorious for its unpredictability. To sail through it was to face two perils side by side, each capable of destruction. On one side was Charybdis, the whirlpool, imagined as a monstrous mouth in the sea. 3 times a day she sucked down the waters and belched them out again in thunderous surges. Any vessel caught in her pull would be swallowed whole. On the other side crouched Scylla, half hidden in her cliffside cave. From her waist sprang 6 necks, long and snake-like, each ending in a savage head with triple rows of teeth. At a ship's passing, each head would dart out, snatching a sailor into the air and devouring him alive. Circe had advised a cruel pragmatism, better to pass nearer Scylla. She would take 6 men, no more, no less, while Charybdis might swallow all. The logic was sound, but it offered no comfort to a leader who valued his men. Odysseus must have wondered which 6 faces would be lost, which voices would be silenced forever in screams. Yet he had no choice but to steer toward her cliff. The description of the strait is one of Homer's most vivid. The sea roared and seethed, the air shook with the thunder of Charybdis drawing down the waves. Above, jagged rocks jutted like teeth, and the shadows of Scylla's cave loomed. The men rowed hard, muscles straining, sweat pouring, eyes wide with fear. Odysseus, in full armour, gripped his spear, though Circe had warned him it would be useless. Perhaps he hoped by defiance alone to shield his men. And then it came, sudden, merciless. 6 necks lashed out from the cave, 6 gaping jaws seized 6 men. Their screams echoed as they were lifted from the deck, flailing helplessly, calling their comrades' names. In a heartbeat they were gone, devoured before their companions' eyes. Odysseus wept openly, admitting later that it was the most dreadful sight he ever endured. He could do nothing. His cunning, his strength, his leadership were all powerless in that moment. Sometimes even heroes must simply endure. This harrowing passage struck a deep chord with Greek audiences. The sea was their highway, but also their terror, and Scylla and Charybdis gave form to the dangers of narrow straits and unpredictable tides. To this day, the phrase "between Scylla and Charybdis" endures, capturing the essence of being caught between two unavoidable dangers. Ancient vase painters depicted Scylla with serpentine bodies and dog-like heads sprouting grotesquely, while Roman mosaics gave Charybdis a monstrous face in the waves. These images served not just as decoration, but as warnings. The sea was never to be taken lightly. When the ship cleared the strait, the men sat silent, mourning their companions. The grief was heavy, yet so too was relief. They had survived, though diminished. Odysseus, his heart wrung, must have wondered how much more he could lose before he reached home. Ahead lay yet another trial, the island of Helios, with its sacred cattle that Tiresias and Circe had forbidden him to touch. Hunger and despair would soon gnaw at his men more fiercely than any monster. But that was still to come. For now they rode on, leaving behind the echo of screams and the memory of songs too sweet to bear. After surviving monsters and whirlpools, one might think Odysseus and his weary crew had earned a peaceful voyage, perhaps a calm sea and a favourable wind. But Homer, ever the dramatist, knew better. Greek heroes were not permitted to rest until they had been tested in every conceivable way. And so the next trial did not come in the form of a monster rising from the sea, but in something far more subtle and arguably more dangerous: hunger. The ship carried the men to the island of Thrinacia, sacred to Helios, the sun god himself. This island was not just a dot of land in the middle of the sea. In Greek imagination, it was one of those uncanny places where divine and mortal spheres overlapped, where every step risked trespass. Helios, unlike Zeus or Poseidon, was not a god to be taken lightly or ignored. His power was absolute and daily visible. He drove his blazing chariot across the sky, illuminating all beneath him. Nothing escaped his notice, which is rather inconvenient if you're hoping to sneak a bit of supper from his sacred herd. Odysseus had been warned not once but twice about this very island, first by Tiresias in the underworld, then again by Circe when he returned to her shores. Both warnings were explicit. Do not harm the cattle of the sun, no matter how dire the hunger. To do so would invite ruin, for Helios would demand vengeance, and Zeus himself would oblige. It was, in essence, the mythological equivalent of a "do not touch" sign, written in fire and thunder. And yet, as history has repeatedly shown, humans have a terrible habit of testing such signs, particularly when their stomachs are empty. Odysseus, at least, took the warning seriously. As they approached Thrinacia, he solemnly instructed his men to avoid the cattle entirely, reminding them of the fates that befell those who ignored divine warnings. His tone, one imagines, carried the weary exasperation of a man who has seen too much folly already. Yet leadership is not only about giving instructions, it's about keeping men alive long enough to follow them. And this, unfortunately, was where matters went awry. The weather, that most ancient of plot devices, turned against them. Zeus sent a storm that pinned the ship on the island for an entire month. The men built huts, rationed what food they had, and prayed for mercy. But as days became weeks, their supplies dwindled, and the gnawing ache of hunger began to twist their thoughts. Homer is careful here, reminding us that the human body, when deprived of food, can drive even disciplined men to desperation. It is no coincidence that ancient Greek culture regarded hospitality, the giving of food and shelter, as a sacred duty. To deny a man bread was to push him closer to dishonour, even madness. At first, the crew obeyed Odysseus's instructions. They hunted fish, dug for roots, even chewed on what scraps they could gather. But hunger is a relentless persuader. And eventually, while Odysseus wandered inland to pray to the gods for deliverance, or perhaps one might wryly note, to give himself a break from his increasingly irritable men, they conspired against him. Led by Eurylochus, that ever-sceptical voice among the crew, they argued that starving to death was a greater folly than offending the gods. After all, Eurylochus reasoned, better to die quickly at sea under Zeus's thunderbolts than to waste away slowly, gnawing on empty bellies. With grim determination, they slaughtered the cattle of Helios. The moment was not taken lightly, even by the mutinous crew. Homer tells us they performed makeshift rites, attempting to justify their act as a kind of offering. But one suspects this was more about easing their consciences than appeasing Helios. After all, roasting divine cattle is rather difficult to disguise as a sacrifice when one also eats the offering. The smell of roasting beef filled the air, a fragrance both delicious and damning. Odysseus, returning to the shore, was horrified. He knew instantly that the men had doomed themselves. And indeed, Helios, who sees all, saw this as well. Enraged, he stormed to Olympus to demand retribution. The Homeric gods, we must remember, were not abstract forces of morality. They were deeply personal beings, quick to anger, proud of their possessions. Helios's cattle were not just animals, they were symbols of his dominion, his pride, his sacred right. To slay them was to insult the very order of the cosmos. Zeus, ever eager to maintain divine balance, agreed to punish the men. But he bided his time, for the gods often allowed mortals the illusion of safety before striking. For several days the crew feasted joyfully. They ate until they could eat no more, savouring what seemed like a reprieve from death. It is almost comical, in a dark way, to imagine their satisfaction, knowing what storm loomed ahead. One can almost hear Homer's audience chuckle grimly, shaking their heads at the foolishness of men who think they can outwit both hunger and the gods. Then, when the winds finally shifted and the ship sailed once more, Zeus unleashed his vengeance. Black clouds gathered, lightning split the sky, and thunder roared across the waves. The sea itself rose in fury, waves towering and crashing down upon the vessel. A bolt of lightning struck the ship, splintering the mast and tearing the hull apart. Men were thrown into the sea, their cries swallowed by the storm. One by one, they disappeared beneath the waves, until only Odysseus clung to a fragment of timber, tossed about like a leaf in a tempest. The punishment was absolute. Every man who had slaughtered the cattle perished, leaving Odysseus once more utterly alone. The scene underscored one of Homer's most enduring themes, the fragility of human life before divine will. No amount of courage, cleverness, or camaraderie can save those who flout the laws of the gods. In this, the story reflected a wider Greek worldview. The cosmos was not governed by fairness or justice in the modern sense, but by balance and reverence. To break sacred order was to invite disaster, as sure as night follows day. There is a historical resonance here as well. ancient Greek seafarers lived in constant dependence upon forces beyond their control. Winds, tides, storms. Sacrifices to gods like Poseidon and Helios were not empty rituals. They were expressions of both fear and gratitude. The slaughter of the cattle dramatized the ultimate taboo, consuming what belongs to the divine, and the consequences illustrated what happened when human desperation collided with sacred law. And yet, within this grim tale lies a very human note of tragedy. The men did not kill the cattle out of arrogance, as some heroes in Greek myth brought doom upon themselves by hubris. They acted out of hunger, a primal, desperate need. In that sense, their fate seems doubly cruel, reminding us that necessity itself does not absolve one of divine law. The gods demanded obedience even when it seemed impossible. It is little wonder that later Greek philosophers wrestled with such stories, questioning whether the gods were truly just or simply powerful. As Odysseus drifted on the wreckage of his ship, battered and alone, he must have pondered the irony of it all. He had endured cyclopes, sirens, whirlpools, and six-headed monsters, only to lose everything because his men could not resist a meal. His cleverness had saved him time and again, but cleverness could not fill their stomachs. Hunger, it turned out, was as deadly as any spear. The waves carried him onward, away from Thrinacia, away from the smouldering wreckage of his crew's folly. His journey was not yet over, far from it. Ahead still lay the nymph Calypso, who would keep him captive for years, and the final trials of Ithaca itself. But in that moment, clinging to a spar of wood beneath a storm-tossed sky, he was once more the solitary survivor, a man stripped of companions, adrift between gods and fate. The island of Helios faded behind him, its sacred cattle lowing no more. And perhaps, had he the strength to laugh, he might have thought that of all the perils he had faced, none was more dangerous than the appetites of hungry men. The sea has a strange way of alternating between cruelty and kindness. It had swallowed Odysseus's crew whole. It had torn his ship apart with the thunderbolts of Zeus, and it had left him drifting on a broken spar, battered by waves and winds. Yet the same sea that punished also delivered. When Odysseus, skin burned by salt, muscles aching, lips cracked, was finally washed ashore, it was not onto jagged rocks that would dash him to pieces, but onto soft sand, shaded by green groves, where he would find rest. He had reached Ogygia, the island of Calypso, though he did not know it yet. Homer lingers in describing Ogygia, and with good reason. This island is not just a backdrop. It is a character in its own right, a vision of paradise. There were lush meadows blooming with violets and wild parsley, fragrant cedar and cypress trees, birds singing sweetly among the branches. Streams of cool, clear water flowed into one another, trickling down to form a chorus of liquid music. Vines heavy with grapes curled around the entrance of a cavern where Calypso dwelt, their green tendrils catching the sunlight. To the ancient Greeks, whose lives were often marked by harsh terrain, arid soil, and uncertain harvests, such a place must have seemed a dream, an impossible oasis. And there within this paradise lived Calypso, daughter of the Titan Atlas. Her name, the Concealer, is telling, for she was fated to hide Odysseus away from the world. She found him on the shore, half dead and clinging to life, and like many nymphs in Greek myth, she felt an immediate pull toward the wanderer. She nursed him, bathed his wounds, fed him roasted meats and sweet wines, clothed him in fine linen. and she did more than heal him. She fell in love with him. Or perhaps, more accurately, she decided she could not bear to let him leave. What followed is one of the great paradoxes of the Odyssey. For 7 long years, Odysseus remained with Calypso. She offered him not only her affection, but immortality itself. If he would stay by her side, she promised, he would never age, never die, never see his body weakened by time. Imagine such an offer to a man who had survived Troy, who had seen companions cut down in battle, who had wept at the sight of men devoured by monsters. Eternal life in a paradise far removed from war and hunger might have sounded like a gift beyond measure. And yet Odysseus was miserable. Homer gives us an image of him sitting upon the shore each day, gazing out at the horizon, tears streaming down his face. Around him stretched paradise, yet his heart was chained to Ithaca. He longed for Penelope, for Telemachus, for the rough soil of his homeland. This longing is not incidental. It is the very essence of Nostos, homecoming, the central theme of the Odyssey. For the Greeks, to be cut off from one's homeland was the deepest wound of all. Here, Homer's genius shows itself. He reminds us that immortality, far from being an unquestioned blessing, can be a burden. To live forever in paradise without the things that matter most, love, family, the rhythm of a mortal life, is no true life at all. Odysseus preferred the fleeting span of human existence, even with all its hardships, to endless eternity without purpose. In this, he differed from many figures in myth who grasped at immortality. Tithonus, granted eternal life without eternal youth, withered into a shriveled husk. Others sought to become gods, only to be punished for their arrogance. Odysseus, by contrast, chose mortality, and, in doing so, revealed a very Greek wisdom. It is the limits of life that make it meaningful. But Calypso was not merely a captor. She loved him, or at least believed she did, and her island was both cage and sanctuary. One imagines her frustration as Odysseus wept day after day for Ithaca. She had offered him everything she could: food, love, even the defiance of death itself. Yet it was not enough. Love, when it demands surrender of the self, becomes a kind of imprisonment. Calypso's affection concealed as much as it revealed. The gods, too, watched all this unfold, and eventually it was Athena who intervened. She had been Odysseus's champion from the beginning, the goddess of wisdom and cunning who saw in him a kindred spirit. She petitioned Zeus to allow him to return home at last, and Zeus, after due deliberation, agreed. He sent Hermes, the swift messenger, with winged sandals to carry the decree to Ogygia. Hermes' arrival on Calypso's island is described with characteristic detail. He found her in her cavern, weaving with a golden shuttle, the air around her filled with fragrance. It is an image that emphasizes her domesticity and her divinity alike, a goddess engaged in the timeless labor of women. When Hermes relayed Zeus's order that she must release Odysseus, Calypso was indignant. She accused the gods of hypocrisy, and with good reason. Male gods, she pointed out, were free to take mortal lovers, to father children with impunity, to keep companions as long as they pleased. Yet when a goddess dared to claim a mortal man, she was scolded and commanded to let him go. It was, she argued, a double standard. Her protest is one of the few places in Homer where a divine female voice challenges the inequities of the cosmos. Calypso's words resonate even today, for they reveal an awareness that the rules of the world, even the divine world were written to favour men. Yet for all her protest, she could not defy Zeus. Reluctantly, with wounded pride, she agreed to obey. When she told Odysseus, her tone was half bitter, half resigned. She framed it as her choice, though both knew it was the will of Zeus. Still, she did not hinder him. Instead, she gave him what he needed: tools to fell trees, an axe to shape them, augers to bore holes, and ropes to lash the timbers. With her guidance, Odysseus built a raft strong enough to withstand the sea. She provisioned it with food and drink, clothed him in garments fit for a traveller, and even gave him a favourable breeze at his departure. For a captor, she proved surprisingly generous in farewell. It is worth pausing here to consider what Ogygia represented to Homer's audience. Geographically, it was nowhere, a mythic place, perhaps imagined on the far western reaches of the world, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where the known Mediterranean ended. Symbolically, it was the very edge of existence, a limbo between life and death, mortality and immortality. For 7 years, Odysseus was suspended there, not dead but not truly alive, caught between worlds. His departure was less an escape than a rebirth, a return to the mortal struggle that defined his existence. There is also a cultural lesson embedded in the tale. Greek sailors venturing beyond familiar waters often imagined islands of wonder at the margins of the sea. These were places where time seemed to stop, where gods mingled with mortals, where one might be trapped in luxury forever. To the Greeks, such places were as much warnings as fantasies. They spoke of the danger of forgetting one's purpose, of losing oneself in comforts that strip away the drive to return. As Odysseus pushed his raft into the sea, we might imagine Calypso standing at the shore watching him go. She remained behind, her love unfulfilled, her paradise once more empty. He carried nothing from Ogygia except the memory of her offer, and his refusal. He had chosen Ithaca over immortality, a decision that marked him as uniquely human, stubbornly loyal to his own mortality. The raft creaked beneath him, the horizon stretched wide, and the sea, as always, waited with new trials. Poseidon, still enraged, had not forgotten him. Ahead lay more storms, more suffering, and the final test of his endurance. But in leaving Ogygia, Odysseus reclaimed something vital: his agency. For 7 years he had been a passive figure, trapped by Calypso's love. Now he was once again the voyager, steering himself, however precariously, toward home. And so the island of Calypso faded into myth, both a paradise and a prison, a reminder that even the most beautiful cage is still a cage. For Odysseus, it was one more trial, one more delay. For us, it is a parable of longing, of the human refusal to accept comfort when it comes at the cost of freedom. In the Odyssey, monsters may terrify and gods may command, but perhaps the greatest danger is forgetting who you are and where you belong. At last, after years of war, wandering, storms, monsters, seductions and losses, the man of twists and turns was nearly home. Odysseus's raft, hastily built with Calypso's guidance, did not carry him far before Poseidon noticed. The sea god, still fuming that Odysseus had blinded his beloved Polyphemus, stirred up a storm so furious it seemed determined to crush not just one man, but the very idea of human resilience. The raft splintered, waves thundered overhead, and Odysseus was tossed like driftwood. And yet, as so often in his tale, just when despair seemed final, help arrived. This time it was Ino, a sea goddess of curious origins, once a mortal woman transformed after a tragic plunge into the waves. She took pity on Odysseus, rising from the surf with her shimmering veil, and advised him to abandon the raft and cling to her divine scarf, which would bear him safely to shore. He hesitated. Odysseus rarely trusted anyone, even gods bearing gifts. But when the mast cracked and the raft broke apart, choice was snatched away. Wrapping Ino's veil about him, he fought through the waves and at last crawled ashore on the island of Scheria, land of the Phaeacians. If Ogygia was timeless paradise, Scheria was civilization perfected, a vision of how the Greeks imagined a prosperous and just society might be. Its king, Alcinous, ruled with fairness, its queen, Arete, was wise and respected, and its people were skilled sailors whose ships moved as swiftly as thought itself. Here Odysseus would find rest, but also the means to complete his journey. Homer lingers lovingly on his reception. Exhausted, naked, salt-encrusted, Odysseus collapsed under an olive bush. In the morning, he was discovered not by warriors or kings, but by Nausicaa, the princess, accompanied by her handmaids. They had come to the river to wash clothes, a detail that reveals much about Greek life, for even royalty was not free from the domestic duties of the household. Nausicaa, unlike many of the women Odysseus had encountered, was both hospitable and modest. She guided him to her father's palace, advising him on how best to win favour with her parents. The palace itself is described in almost architectural ecstasy. Walls gleaming with bronze, doors made of silver and gold, orchards heavy with fruit that never ceased bearing. To the Greeks, such abundance must have seemed near divine, the kind of prosperity that bordered on immortality. And here, at last, Odysseus told his full tale. Up to this point, much of his wanderings had been implied, but now he recounted them in full. The Cyclops, Circe, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, Calypso. One imagines the Phaeacians listening, wide-eyed, as though hearing the very blueprint of myth itself. Alcinous, moved by his story, promised to help. The Phaeacians placed Odysseus on one of their magical ships, loaded with treasures, a generosity that would, ironically, doom them. For when Poseidon saw what they had done, he punished them by petrifying the very ship that carried Odysseus, turning it to stone as it entered their harbour. Thus, even kindness to the wanderer had its price. But Odysseus at last set foot upon Ithaca, though not in triumphal fanfare. Athena, ever his ally, cloaked him in mist and disguised him as an old beggar. Why? Because Ithaca was no longer safe. In his absence, suitors had overrun his halls, feasting on his livestock, wooing his wife, plotting to seize his throne. These were not noble rivals, but greedy opportunists, arrogant in their consumption and disrespectful of Xenia, the sacred code of hospitality. To the Greeks, violating Xenia was not merely rude, it was sacrilege, and the suitors had gorged themselves on it for years. So Odysseus crept into his homeland in rags, unrecognized by all but his faithful old dog, Argos. And here, Homer breaks hearts. Argos, once swift and strong, lay neglected on a dung heap, too weak to move. Yet when he heard his master's voice, his ears pricked, his tail gave a feeble wag, and he died, at peace at last, having waited 20 years to see his master return. It is a moment of devastating simplicity, a reminder that loyalty outlives strength. Disguised still, Odysseus sought out allies. He revealed himself to his son, Telemachus, who had grown into a man during his absence. The reunion between father and son is tender but strategic. They weep together, but soon turn to plotting vengeance. With Athena's guidance, they prepare for the reckoning. Penelope, meanwhile, remained the image of patience and wit. For 20 years she had delayed the suitors, weaving by day and unpicking her loom by night, promising to choose a husband once her weaving was complete. It was a clever trick, but even cleverness has limits. Now the suitors pressed harder, demanding she choose. She devised a final contest. Whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads would win her hand. The challenge was nearly impossible. The bow was massive, and only Odysseus had ever wielded it with ease. The day came. One by one, the suitors tried and failed, grunting and straining, the bow refusing their efforts. Then the beggar stepped forward. They laughed, mocked, even scolded Penelope for allowing him a chance. But Odysseus, calm, steady, strung the bow with the ease of a bard tightening his lyre. He notched an arrow, let it fly, and it sang clean through the line of axe heads. In that instant, silence fell, and then fury broke loose. Odysseus revealed himself, his disguise cast aside. Together with Telemachus and a few loyal servants, he slaughtered the shooters in a scene as bloody as any on the plains of Troy. Arrows flew, swords clashed, and bodies piled upon the feasting hall floor. When it ended, the violators of hospitality lay dead, justice meted out by the hand of the long-absent king. Yet even then, reunion was not simple. When Penelope finally faced Odysseus, she did not throw herself into his arms. She was cautious, skeptical. After all, many men had tried to deceive her. So she devised one final test. She ordered a servant to move their marriage bed into another room. At this, Odysseus cried out in protest. The bed could not be moved, for he himself had built it around the trunk of an olive tree, its roots sunk deep into the earth. Only he could know this secret, and with that, Penelope knew beyond doubt that her husband had returned. At last, after 20 years, they embraced. The Odyssey could end there, but Homer lingers. The suitors' families clamoured for revenge, and bloodshed threatened to plunge Ithaca into civil war. Yet Athena, descending in a blaze of divine authority, declared peace. Her word was final, for even vengeance has its limits when the gods demand closure. Thus, with order restored, Odysseus was truly home. What do we make of this ending? It is not the fairy tale resolution one might expect. Odysseus does not return to a throne untouched, but to a land scarred by absence, a family worn by grief, a kingdom unstable. The lesson is not that homecoming erases suffering, but that endurance, wit, and loyalty can survive it. For the Greeks, this was enough. Nostos was not about happy endings, but about the unyielding pull of belonging, the refusal to surrender to exile. The Odyssey closes with Odysseus where he always longed to be, beside Penelope, in his own bed, within his own walls. Yet we sense that his journey never truly ends. Heroes of Greek myth are not allowed quiet retirements. They remain restless, marked by the trials they have endured. For Odysseus, the sea will always whisper, the gods will always watch, and the memory of wandering will always linger. But for one moment at least, he had achieved what seemed impossible. He had come home. So, the war was over. Troy had burned, its once proud towers now reduced to crumbled stone and smouldering ash. The Greeks had done what they came for. though it had taken 10 years, a wooden horse, and no small amount of divine interference. They stood victorious, weary and weathered, clutching the spoils of war and preparing for home. But of course no one ever said getting home would be simple. One might assume that after 10 years abroad, a warrior could simply board his ship and sail back to the comforts of hearth and wife. That was rarely the case. This was ancient Greece after all, a place where the gods were fickle, the seas treacherous, and even the stars occasionally refused to cooperate. The journey home, or nostos as the Greeks called it, would prove just as storied and sorrowful as the war itself. Let us begin with the most infamous of these journeys, that of Odysseus. King of Ithaca, famed for his cunning, inventor of the Trojan horse, or at least the best PR for it, and very much unprepared for how long a simple boat ride could take when Poseidon was in a foul mood. You see, Odysseus made a rather unfortunate decision upon departing Troy. He didn't thank the gods properly. A small omission, but one that would stretch a short voyage into a 10-year odyssey. Poseidon, god of the sea, was particularly offended. It didn't help that Odysseus had blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, along the way. In fairness, Polyphemus had eaten several of his crew and didn't respond well to reasoned discussion. Still, the sea god was not the forgiving type. So Odysseus was tossed from island to island, seduced by nymphs, shipwrecked repeatedly, and even made to visit the land of the dead, just in case things weren't miserable enough already. But Odysseus was not alone in his troubles. The Greeks had split into various homeward-bound contingents, each facing their own ill luck. Menelaus, husband of Helen, the woman allegedly responsible for all this carnage, took a rather indirect route home. He wandered as far as Egypt, which, even by heroic standards, is rather off course. There he wrestled with the shape-shifting sea god Proteus, as one does, in order to gain the knowledge of how to appease the gods and calm the winds. This required holding Proteus tightly while he transformed into a lion, a snake, a tree, and a stream of water, before finally surrendering his secrets. There were no shortcuts in Bronze Age travel. Historical records, well, as much as we can call them that, do suggest that Greek sailors at the time weren't especially equipped for reliable maritime navigation. They hugged coastlines, avoided night travel, and interpreted weather patterns through a mixture of guesswork and prayer. Their ships were sturdy enough for the Aegean, but the open Mediterranean posed significant challenges. Add to this the divine meddling, and one can see why so many of these heroes took the scenic route home. Diomedes, one of the mightiest warriors of the war, fared little better. He returned to Argos only to find that his wife had taken a lover during his absence and was plotting to kill him. To her credit, 10 years is a long time. Rather than make a fuss, Diomedes fled to Italy, where he eventually faded into the vague mists of local legend, worshipped in some places as a minor deity. A rather anticlimactic ending for a man who once wounded both Ares and Aphrodite in battle. Nestor, the oldest and perhaps wisest of the Greek commanders, seems to have made it home without too much divine harassment. It helps, one suspects, that he kept his head down, said his prayers, and refrained from boasting about clever ideas involving wooden horses. There's a lesson in that. Agamemnon, leader of the Greek coalition and brother to Menelaus, did reach home, only to be murdered in his bath by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. but more on that particular bit of family dysfunction in the next chapter. Suffice it to say, the post-war glow did not last long for the house of Atreus. There was a curious sense in the Greek imagination that war never truly ended. Victory was merely the prelude to a different kind of suffering. The gods did not reward triumph with peace. In fact, they often punished it. Hubris, that quintessentially Greek concept of arrogant pride, was a capital offence in the eyes of Olympus. If a man returned home boasting of his glory, he was inviting divine correction. And then there were the storms. Natural, of course, but also supernatural. The seas between Troy and Greece were notoriously rough. The Hellespont, the Aegean, and beyond, all capricious, especially to ships lacking proper ballast or understanding of wind currents. The Greeks often personified these elements as gods or spirits, harpies, sea nymphs, angry winds. Because when your fleet is scattered overnight and half your crew vanishes, blaming an angry goddess feels more comforting than admitting you misread a cloud. The return home also meant confronting time itself. 10 years of war meant a decade lost. Children grew up without fathers, political alliances shifted, and thrones were not always waiting patiently for their former occupants. The journey was not just geographical, it was existential. These men returned not as heroes, but as strangers. This theme runs deeply through Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus longs for home, for Ithaca, for Penelope and Telemachus. Yet at every turn he's offered comfort, even immortality, by figures like Calypso. Still, he chooses hardship. The Greek mind revered the idea of nostos, but it also understood that one could never truly go home unchanged. The home you remembered was gone, and so were you. Meanwhile, the gods watched all this with their usual mix of boredom and caprice. Athena took a special interest in Odysseus, helping him occasionally when she remembered to, while Zeus played both sides as usual. Poseidon sulked, Hermes ferried souls to the underworld, and Apollo, who had spent much of the war firing plague arrows, returned to more musical pursuits. The war had ended, but peace was elusive. Even those who made it back without divine interference faced restless kingdoms and unruly citizens. Some were worshipped, others resented. The line between hero and troublemaker blurred easily. And what of the ships themselves? Ancient Greek ships, primarily pentaconters and biremes, were long, narrow, and powered by both sails and oars. They weren't built for comfort. There were no cabins, no galleys, no protection from the elements. Sailors slept where they could, ate cold rations, and relied on wind and muscle. Navigation was by stars, sun, and intuition. That so many even attempted long voyages is a testament to their stubborn optimism. Or perhaps their lack of alternatives. Many of the ships were lost, scattered in storms or dashed against unfamiliar shores. The sea claimed them silently. No epic poems were written for those whose names did not survive, but their ghosts, one imagines, lingered along lonely beaches and under wine-dark waves. In the centuries that followed, Greek poets and playwrights would return again and again to these post-war stories. The nostoi, as they came to be called, were an entire genre. The war was a given, brutal but glorious. The return, though, was where the real drama lay. That's where men broke, or bent, or found meaning. We're used to thinking of myths as grand, flashy things. Monsters, magic, climactic battles. But the Greeks understood that the quiet aftermath was where tragedy bloomed. The war ended with a horse and fire. But the real stories began when the sails went up, and home became a dream somewhere on the horizon. Even in the archaeological record, there are hints of this turbulent return. Many Mycenaean palaces show signs of sudden destruction around the same period: burned walls, toppled columns, abandoned treasures. Was it invasion, rebellion, or simply the long echo of a war that refused to stay on foreign soil? Historians debate, as they always do, but the myth has its own answers. The gods were not finished yet, so the Greeks sailed home, slowly, painfully, circuitously. They were shipwrecked, seduced, cursed, and forgotten. Some never arrived. Others returned only to find they were no longer welcome, and a few, like Odysseus, clung to the memory of home like a compass, trusting that however long the journey, there was still something waiting at the end. Whether there was or not, well, that's another story. So, let us now drift back into the murky waters of post-war homecomings. If you were hoping that at least one Greek king had a cheerful reunion with his family after 10 years away, I'm afraid you've wandered into the wrong epic. This is the tale of Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces at Troy, brother to Menelaus, and a man whose homecoming can be summed up in 2 words: unfortunately brief. Agamemnon had led the 1,000-ship fleet to Troy and played his part with ruthless efficiency. He sacrificed his own daughter to appease the winds, squabbled with Achilles over a slave girl, and generally made himself disagreeable to gods and men alike. He did, however, win the war, which you might think would count for something, but his victory came at a price, one that followed him all the way back to Mycenae, where his wife, Clytemnestra, was waiting. Now, the story of Clytemnestra is not a cheerful one, but she is often painted far too simply, as a vindictive woman with a grudge. In truth, she had good reason to be angry. Years before, Agamemnon had sacrificed their daughter, Iphigenia, to ensure favourable winds for the Greek fleet. No warning, no consultation. Just a priest, an altar, and a quiet murder dressed up as a divine necessity. Clytemnestra, understandably, took it personally. While Agamemnon was away playing war hero, she had not exactly remained idle. She took a lover, Aegisthus, a man with his own reasons to loathe the house of Atreus, and together they plotted. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice, retribution, and perhaps a bit of long overdue housekeeping. And so, after years of war and an arduous return journey, Agamemnon finally sailed into the bay beneath his palace, the bronze towers of Mycenae gleaming in the distance. One can imagine him standing on the deck of his ship, sun-worn and grimy, dreaming of a warm bath and roasted lamb. Unfortunately, that bath would be the last comfort he ever knew. In Aeschylus's Agamemnon, the king arrives with Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess he had taken as a war prize. Now, bringing home a captive concubine might seem a rather bold decision when your wife is already displeased, but Agamemnon never was known for subtlety. Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to see the future, but never be believed, saw exactly what was coming. She walked into the palace like a woman entering a tomb, resigned, poetic, and ignored. The bath was drawn, the robes laid out, and there, amid the steam and ceremony of a long-awaited homecoming, Clytemnestra murdered her husband with an axe, or perhaps a sword. The details vary, as myths tend to do. In some versions, she entangles him in a net before the killing blow. In others, he's struck as he reclines, utterly unaware. But all agree on the outcome. Agamemnon, war hero and king, dead in his own house by his wife's hand. It wasn't just personal, it was political, symbolic, even ritualistic. The house of Atreus had long been a mire of curses, betrayals and bloodshed. Tantalus, Atreus, Thyestes. Each generation passed down a fresh scandal. Agamemnon's death was less a surprise than a grim inevitability. The Greeks, ever lovers of a tragic arc, saw this not merely as domestic drama, but divine rebalancing. You see, no crime went unpunished in the world of myth, especially not those committed against family. Agamemnon's sacrifice of Iphigenia had broken a sacred bond, and blood, as always, demanded more blood. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus ruled Mycenae together for several years after the murder. By some accounts, they were competent, even prosperous rulers. But the shadow of what they'd done lingered. And somewhere far away, growing older in exile, Agamemnon's son, Orestes, was watching, waiting, and nursing a very different idea of justice. Before we turn to him, it's worth pausing to consider the historical underpinnings of all this myth. Mycenae was indeed a real place, an imposing Bronze Age citadel with massive stone walls and a commanding view of the surrounding valley. The shaft graves of Mycenaean kings, discovered centuries later, revealed a world of wealth, weaponry, and ceremonial grandeur. One grave contained a golden death mask, once romantically dubbed the Mask of Agamemnon, though the identification is largely wishful thinking. Still, the myths do seem to echo something real, that returning warriors found their homes changed, their families distant, and their power unstable. In many Mycenaean centres, we find signs of abrupt destruction or abandonment around the same time period, evidence, perhaps, of internal unrest or social collapse. It's not hard to imagine that some kings returned home only to face suspicion, usurpation, or worse. Back in the myth, Agamemnon's fate was only the beginning of a longer tragedy. Clytemnestra may have seen herself as an avenger, but in the logic of Greek myth, she was also a murderer. And the gods, as always, had opinions. Enter Orestes. Raised in exile, likely by allies of his father or sympathetic family retainers, Orestes grew up with one goal: to avenge his father's death. But here the myth gets deliciously tangled. To kill one's mother, even a murderous one, was not a simple act of vengeance. It was a spiritual crime, one that brought its own consequences. When Orestes returned to Mycenae, he did what he believed was necessary. He killed Aegisthus first, which no one particularly objected to. Then he confronted Clytemnestra. In some retellings, she pleads with him, bares her breast, reminds him that she gave him life. But Orestes, trembling with fury and fate, strikes her down. The moment is terrible, quiet, almost ritualistic. And then the Furies come. The Greeks called them the Erinyes, ancient goddesses of vengeance who pursued those who spilled kindred blood. Black-robed, snake-haired, they drove Orestes into madness. He fled from temple to temple, seeking purification, but the Furies were relentless. Guilt in the ancient Greek mind was not a matter of conscience. It was an external force, almost a physical illness, stalking the sinner until justice was done. Eventually, Orestes found sanctuary in Athens, where the goddess Athena intervened. In a trial on the Areopagus, a rocky outcrop used for real-life criminal cases, she declared that the cycle of blood vengeance must end. Orestes was acquitted, and the Furies, soothed by the promise of new rights and honour, became the Eumenides, the kindly ones. It's a tidy mythological solution to the messy business of familial revenge. The story of Agamemnon and his family was endlessly retold in Greek tragedy. Aeschylus's Oresteia, Euripides' Electra, Sophocles' Electra. Each playwright offered their own shading. Was Clytemnestra a villain, or a mother driven to desperate justice? Was Orestes a hero, or a victim of divine contradiction? These were not tales with clear morals, but rather mirrors for the Greeks to reflect on law, loyalty, and the dangerous gravity of blood. From a cultural perspective, the myth encapsulated deep anxieties about power and homecoming. The idea that a king, triumphant abroad, might return only to fall in his own bath. It struck a chord. Greece was no stranger to political upheaval. City-states were rife with coups, assassinations, and shifting loyalties. The myth merely dressed these realities in poetic garb. And then there's Cassandra, the tragic footnote. Cursed by Apollo to prophesy truly but be ignored, she knew what would happen the moment they stepped ashore. In most versions, she was murdered alongside Agamemnon, either in the palace or just outside it. Her death, barely remarked upon in many accounts, adds a final note of melancholy to the tale. She had seen it all and still could not stop it. Cassandra's curse is one of those mythic touches that feels eerily modern. To know the truth and be disbelieved, there's something timeless about that. She becomes a symbol not just of doomed foresight, but of the loneliness that comes with clarity. The home of Agamemnon thus became a kind of mythological crime scene, revisited again and again by poets, playwrights, and priests. It was a cautionary tale, a tragic cycle, and a puzzle box of competing ethics. Was Agamemnon a villain for killing his daughter? Was Clytemnestra right to kill him? Was Orestes justified in avenging his father? Each answer led to another question. But for our purposes, here in the soft, slow hours of night, it is enough to say that Agamemnon came home and died. That a bath, which might have been warm and soothing, became a tomb. That behind palace walls, the real war continued, quieter but no less brutal. And that even kings, even the great and bronze-clad, were not spared the price of their choices. So the torch of vengeance passed from hand to hand, from Clytemnestra to Orestes, from gods to mortals and back again. And in the quiet corridors of Mycenae, the stones remembered it all. Tomorrow, perhaps, we'll visit Odysseus again. But for now, let us rest in the ruins of a palace where the echoes of footsteps, long silence, still murmur their ancient regrets. Let us now turn to a man who, more than any other, came to embody the very concept of Nostos, the homecoming. Odysseus, king of the modest island of Ithaca, veteran of the Trojan War, and possessor of a famously complicated relationship with the gods. His story, immortalized in Homer's Odyssey, is less a journey and more an endurance test, a 10-year sequence of delays, detours, distractions, and divine punishments. In truth, if he'd just taken the ferry and kept his head down, he might have been home in a week. But where would the poetry be in that? Odysseus had a reputation for cleverness. He devised the idea of the Trojan horse after all, though how much of that was his idea and how much poetic license, we'll never know. Regardless, it was a decision that ensured the city's fall and secured his place in history, and Poseidon's grudge list. The trouble began shortly after he and his men set sail from Troy. The gods were, let's say, less than pleased. In some versions, Odysseus forgot to thank them. In others, he was simply caught up in the divine fallout of the war. Most notably, he had offended Poseidon by blinding the Cyclops Polyphemus. A necessary act of survival, yes, But when the giant turns out to be the sea god's son, well, you can expect choppy waters ahead. And so the long voyage began. One might imagine that the journey from Troy to Ithaca, roughly 1,000 kilometres, wouldn't take a decade, even in a boat powered by oars and optimism. But then, Odysseus had a particular knack for getting lost in spectacular ways. The first stop was the land of the Cicones, where his men made the classic mistake of raiding a village, overstaying their welcome, and being driven off by the locals. Not exactly an auspicious start. Then came the Lotus Eaters, a rather dreamlike group who offered Odysseus's crew a plant that made them forget all desire to return home. A tempting proposition that, and one might argue, more peaceful than anything that came after. Still, Odysseus, annoyingly responsible, dragged them back to the ships and sailed on. Next was the infamous encounter with the Cyclops. Trapped in a cave with Polyphemus, Odysseus introduced himself, cleverly, as nobody, got the giant drunk on strong wine, and blinded him with a red-hot steak. When the Cyclops screamed for help, shouting that nobody is hurting me, his fellow giants presumably shrugged and went back to napping. It was ingenious, really. Unfortunately, before sailing off, Odysseus made the crucial mistake of shouting his real name back at Polyphemus. This allowed the injured Cyclops to pray to Poseidon for vengeance, and Poseidon, being a rather involved parent, obliged. Now firmly on the god's naughty list, Odysseus continued his zigzagging path across the wine-dark sea. He stopped next at the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus was surprisingly helpful, bottling up all the adverse winds in a bag and giving Odysseus only the breeze he needed. All would have been well, if only Odysseus's crew hadn't been quite so curious. Thinking the bag contained treasure, they opened it just as Ithaca came into view. The winds escaped, a storm rose, and they were blown back to square one. One imagines Odysseus briefly contemplating life as a shepherd instead. Then came the Laestrygonians, giants with a talent for smashing ships and eating sailors. Most of Odysseus's fleet was destroyed here, leaving him with just one vessel. It's the sort of incident that tends to dampen morale, though one suspects Odysseus had already adjusted to lowered expectations. From there, it was on to the island of Circe, enchantress, sorceress, part-time pig farmer. She turned his men into swine, as one does, though whether that was punishment or commentary is unclear. Hermes, ever helpful, gave Odysseus a magical herb called moly to protect him. With it, he resisted Circe's magic, and depending on the version, either threatened her or charmed her into restoring his men. He then spent a year there, comfortably ensconced in her company. A rather long delay, though Circe did have a very nice villa. But even Circe couldn't stall fate forever. Before he could leave, she told him he would need to visit the underworld and consult the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias. It was the sort of thing Greek heroes were expected to do on long journeys, a little necromancy between islands. So, Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world, sacrificed a ram, and waited while the dead gathered round. Tiresias offered a grim forecast: hardship, loss, and danger. But eventually, if he was careful, Odysseus might reach home. He also saw the shades of his mother, Achilles and Agamemnon, who, you may recall, had recently had a very bad bath. Emerging from the land of the dead with no small amount of existential baggage, Odysseus returned to Circe, who provided more advice. Avoid the sirens, she said, seductive singers who lured sailors to their deaths. Odysseus, ever the curious one, had his men plug their ears with wax while he had himself tied to the mast, just so he could hear their song without succumbing. It was, admittedly, a very Odyssean solution. Practical, perilous, and just a bit arrogant. Next came Scylla and Charybdis, a six-headed monster and a ravenous whirlpool placed inconveniently close together. Odysseus steered toward Scylla, sacrificing a few men rather than risk the entire ship. It's the sort of decision that ancient Greek leaders were expected to make without blinking, though one suspects there were some complaints from the rowing benches. At last, they reached the island of Phrynicia, where sacred cattle belonging to Helios, the sun god, grazed in peace. Odysseus warned his men not to touch them. They promised. And then, while he was napping, they promptly slaughtered and ate several. Helios, unsurprisingly furious, demanded punishment. Zeus obliged with a storm that destroyed the last of Odysseus's crew. Only the man himself survived, clinging to a broken mast, drifting aimlessly until he washed up on the island of Ogygia. Here he met Calypso, a beautiful nymph who offered him immortality if he would stay. It might have seemed like a good deal. No more storms, no more monsters, and an eternity of relaxation. But Odysseus longed for home, for Penelope, for Ithaca. Calypso, both tender and sorrowful, let him go, but not before 7 long years had passed. A different kind of imprisonment, that. Comfort without belonging. At last, with divine help, Odysseus built a raft and sailed once more. Poseidon, still holding a grudge, sent another storm. The poor man could hardly sneeze without attracting weather. He was eventually washed ashore on the land of the Phaeacians, who thankfully turned out to be decent people. They gave him food, clothes, and a proper ship home. After 10 years of wandering, he reached Ithaca at last. But even then, the journey wasn't quite over. His home had been overrun by suitors, dozens of grasping, boastful men courting his wife and feasting in his halls. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus plotted his revenge. With the help of his son Telemachus, he strung his old bow and dispatched the shooters in a rather bloody finale. Arrows, spears, and poetic justice all around. At last, he revealed himself to Penelope. She, ever cautious, tested him with a secret known only to them, the construction of their bed carved from a rooted olive tree. When Odysseus answered correctly, she wept, and they were reunited. A quiet, hard-won reunion after 20 years apart. Now, what are we to make of all this? On one level, the Odyssey is an adventure, a tapestry of strange lands and strange creatures. But beneath it all lies something deeper, the fear of never getting home,